Husband has some savings too? Maybe you could take out a loan for us? That was it. That was the moment I knew there was no reasoning with them. They weren't looking for a way to fix their mistakes. They were looking for someone else to shoulder the burden. I stood up, looked them both in the eyes and said, "You made it clear a long time ago that I wasn't your priority. Now, I'm making it clear that your problems aren't mine." My father exploded, calling me ungrateful, saying that family is supposed to help each other. My mother sobbed, pleading, telling me she had no one else to turn to. But I just shook my head. "You had a choice," I told them. "You chose to give everything to my sister. Now you have to live with that choice." And with that, I walked out. I won't pretend it didn't hurt. I won't pretend that I didn't sit in my car for a long time afterward, staring at the steering wheel, trying to process everything. But I also won't pretend that I regret it. Because for the first time in my life, I chose me. Not their expectations. Not their endless favoritism. Just me. I don't know what's going to happen to them. Maybe they'll find another way out of their mess. Maybe they won't. But whatever happens, I know one thing for sure. I'm done being the backup plan they never cared about until they needed me. And I'm finally at peace with that. When my parents asked my husband and me to liquidate something from our retirement fund to bail them out, it was clear they were essentially asking us to destroy our own financial future to rescue them from a mess they created. That was the moment everything became clear. There was no going back. I told them, firmly, that I wasn't going to pay for their debts. They had made their choices, poured everything into my sister's extravagant wedding and her doomed marriage, and now they had to live with the consequences. I reminded them that they had decided I didn't need anything from them when they disinherited me, and if that was the stance they took, then they had to stick with it. My mother burst into tears, accusing me of being heartless, while my father muttered something about how selfish I was. That's when I realized I was done. I turned around, walked out of their house, and made a decision right then and there. I was cutting them off completely. No more calls, no more texts, no more begging or guilt trips. Over the years, I had yearned for their approval, their affection, but it had become painfully clear that it wasn't worth sacrificing my own peace of mind. At first, I felt a pang of guilt, but it lasted for all of 5 seconds before the memories of how they had always treated me like a backup plan came flooding back. It may seem harsh, but in that moment, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. A week passed without any contact from my parents, and I thought that maybe, just maybe, they had finally understood my message. But then, the calls and texts started coming in, not from them directly, but from distant relatives. Aunts and uncles I barely spoke to suddenly had a lot to say about forgiving my parents and helping them. I kept hearing the same infuriating phrase over and over. They're your parents, after all. Family is supposed to support each other. It was maddening. I tried explaining my side, how they had disinherited me, how they had spent all their money on my sister while leaving me with nothing. But it felt like no one actually wanted to hear the details. All they saw was my parents struggling, and in their eyes, that automatically made it my responsibility to bail them out. One uncle, someone who had barely acknowledged me growing up, actually called to say, if you don't help them, they could lose their home. Do you really want that on your conscience? I was stunned. Part of me wanted to snap, to scream, where were you when they decided I wasn't part of their future? But I didn't bother. I just calmly said that I wasn't able to help and left it at that. My husband told me not to get caught up in the drama, especially since we had our own lives and bills to take care of. I tried blocking numbers, but they kept coming from different phones, different social media accounts. Eventually, I had to make a public post explaining my side and saying I wouldn't be discussing it any further. Of course, that only made things worse. Some cousins were shocked to learn the full extent of what my parents had done. Others stuck to my parents' side, probably because they had been fed a twisted version of events. I didn't have the energy to argue. I just started ignoring the messages and focusing on my life. But every time my phone lit up with an unfamiliar number, my stomach would drop, dreading another guilt trip or manipulative ploy. The only surprising thing was that my sister hadn't reached out at all. Part of me was relieved, but part of me wondered if she was just biding her time, waiting for the perfect opportunity to guilt trip me as well. I worked hard in my early 20s to establish boundaries with my parents, going through therapy to unlearn the guilt they had conditioned me to feel. They had always been the type to meddle, to manipulate, and to demand that I meet their expectations. But therapy taught me an important truth. I don't owe them a blank check just because they're my parents. Respect is a two-way street, and they had never given me any. So no matter how harsh my decision might seem from the outside, I was standing firm. They weren't just breaking our bond, they had burned it to the ground. I had no obligation to be the one to rebuild it. A couple of weeks passed, and I heard through a mutual friend that my parents were scrambling to refinance their home. They still had some equity, but with interest rates being what they were, things weren't looking good. Then, my father did something that completely floored me. He actually tried to contact my husband's employer to verify our financial standing. It was beyond humiliating. My husband's boss called him into the office and said, your father-in-law just tried to ask personal financial questions about you guys. I couldn't believe it. The sheer desperation of it made me realize just how far my parents were willing to go. And yet, I still couldn't bring myself to feel pity. If anything, it only solidified my decision to keep my distance. If they were willing to cross that line, what else would they do? Meanwhile, my sister's life was falling apart. I found out she and her husband had separated, and she had moved back in with our parents. The lavish lifestyle they had bankrolled for her was gone. The same mutual friend mentioned that my sister was complaining non-stop about how everything had crumbled and how no one was stepping in to fix it. Well, she was right about one thing. I wasn't helping. My mother, of course, blamed me. She had apparently told my sister that I was refusing to provide any financial support, leading my sister to believe I was sitting on piles of money and simply choosing not to share. If that's what she wanted to believe, so be it. The truth was, even if I had the resources to bail them out, I wouldn't. I had worked too hard to build a life where I no longer enabled bad behavior. Then came the final insult. My mother sent me a long, desperate email outlining their struggles, and she ended it with a sentence that made my blood boil. If you won't help out of love, then at least do it so we can finally acknowledge you as a rightful part of this family. That was it. That was the moment every last shred of hope I had for reconciliation died. They had made it clear before that I wasn't worthy of their inheritance, that I didn't need anything from them. And now, they were dangling some hollow version of acceptance in front of me, like a bribe. I didn't even reply. I just marked the email as read and moved on with my day. In their world, they still believed they could manipulate me into bailing them out. In mine, I was focused on protecting my own stability and peace. A few days later, I got a handwritten letter in the mail from my father. It was a mess of apologies, blame, and desperation. He actually wrote that parents had the right to distribute their assets as they saw fit, but that as their child, I was supposed to be the backup plan when things went wrong. He even tried to guilt-trip me by listing all the money they had spent raising me, as if I owed them repayment for simply doing their duty as parents. Reading that letter made me feel physically ill. I wrote a short response. I appreciate that you provided for me as a child, but that was your responsibility. I don't owe you a bailout for your poor financial decisions, and I refuse to be manipulated. I mailed it, knowing it would be the last time I ever reached out. Looking back, I'm still amazed at how this all unraveled. My parents made their choice. They favored one child to the extreme and assumed I'd be there as a safety net. But ironically, their actions made me strong enough to walk away. It might seem cold to some, but I finally understand that sometimes, self-preservation has to come first. I'm focusing on my life, my marriage, and my future. And for the first time in years, I feel free.